What if one bad review was all it took to silence your podcast for a year or forever? That's exactly what happened to fellow podcast host and Pod Launch graduate Janine Mix. But instead of giving up, she came back stronger than ever. And she's creating a podcast that her listeners feel like it was made just for them. And she's here today to share how she overcame her fear of rejection, found her voice, and crafted a show her audience can't stop talking about, and how you can do the same. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Janine, welcome to the show. I am so excited that you are here today.
I'm so excited to be here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you.
Well, we have a lot to dig into and a lot of counterintuitive things that I know we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to backtrack because I know that you had a podcast previously that you started a couple years before we had started working together. And I would love for you to take us through what worked for that podcast, but also what didn't work, which ultimately led you to working with us here at Pod Launch.
So I launched my podcast, I think 2 years ago originally, and it was Permission to Launch. And one thing that worked for me was I really was very strategic about how I launched my episodes right out of the bat. And one of the things that worked really well was I did end up ranking pretty high, doing it all organically, not knowing what the heck I was doing because I had prepared for those episodes. I had done a pretty successful launch. I had already thought about doing a launch crew and some of these things to get some support from friends and sharing. I did a big giveaway. So there was a lot I wrapped around that launch day to really rank really well and get a lot of downloads in those first episodes. So yeah, I feel like what went well was the launch and leading up to it. And I did have clarity on who I wanted it to be for. It was a little bit more umbrella, like generic. It wasn't as micro niched down. And I would say one thing that was really missing from it when I launched was being bold in my faith. So it's still, even though I launched, it still felt like I was limiting myself to what I wanted to say and what I felt like I was being called to say. So those are the things that I feel like were good and bad. And then I got my first bad review, within that same launch week. I think I recorded maybe 2 or 3 podcasts after that, and then it went dead for a year. And that's crazy to say out loud. But you have been a mentor for me for a whole year, and you know how much I had to now battle that. How do I find my voice after I feel like someone just shredded me apart, on a deep internal level? That was really tough. And I know when I started working for you, I felt like my mouth was covered, like someone was covering my mouth and I wasn't allowed to share. And it's just crazy to think that this one person who happens to not be an ideal listener at all can affect me so much. But it was when you put anything out into the world and you share your voice and your thoughts and your opinions, podcasting is very vulnerable. When you put that out in the world and you get that kind of feedback and you really let it define you and you let it control what you do. And again, it's for the wrong person. My podcast wasn't for that person. And I let that person and my insecurity and my fear get the best of me. And that was the biggest mistake that I made, because I think about if I had just kept going, my podcast would be, I think, in a much better spot. But it's okay. What you've taught me is I can start over and I can definitely align it more with my vision in my heart and still have the success.
Well, I want to get into the clarity that you've got with your podcast now. But before we do, I just want to acknowledge that story that you just shared, because I feel like this is something, first of all, it's hard for us to talk about as creators. And the bigger you get, the more haters you're going to have. I don't remember where I first heard that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that terrifies me. And yet, as I have grown, I've also learned it's very true. And there are going to be those people who, for whatever reason, whatever's going on in their internal world that day, that they chose to take that out on you in some capacity. And it's amazing the energetic ramifications that can have. And like you said, that wasn't even your ideal listener. And yet it affected you in a big way, because it was almost as if here you are doing this huge thing, putting yourself on the line and saying, okay, I'm going to do this podcast. I'm going to allow myself to be seen and to be visible. And yet someone just comes in and says whatever they say. And then you're like, okay, here's the exact reason why I shouldn't be doing this. So your brain goes into protection mode and everything shuts down. And then we actually can stall our own growth and our own progress, sometimes without even realizing it, simply because we're trying to protect ourselves from ever feeling that emotional stab to the gut and that rejection ever again. And I know, Janine, I've had many experiences like this myself, and it's so hard. It's so hard. So I just want to acknowledge you first and foremost that, yes, even though your podcast was on pause for a year after that, you still picked it back up. You still picked it back up. And you said, you know what? I'm not going to let this define me. And that is huge.
And it's interesting because I worked with someone that you recommended on a little bit of coaching on my voice and working through some of that. And she had me read that review, and I hadn't read it in like a year and a half. I was like, I'm not going to, like, I read it that one time. So she said, what do you think the review said? And I thought that was really interesting. It said this, this, and this, and this. And then I read the review, and reading it the second time didn't hurt as much. And also I kind of had it wrong. Like, it wasn't as bad as I remember. And I was like, dang it, I just let that hold me back for so long. And I've received criticism before, but there is something about a podcast and your voice and your message. There's just something really deep about that. Like, I can do an Instagram story all day long, and if I have someone that doesn't agree with me, it doesn't bother me. But when you're putting out things around money, around faith, around business, and things that you really care about, because a podcast is a long game, right? Like, you're not just like, I don't know, talking about random stuff on a podcast. You're trying to share your voice and message with the world. And so there's something more vulnerable about that. But I thought it was so funny that she made me read it, and I was like so nervous about it. I'm like, oh, it actually wasn't as bad, which is so dumb. But in all good timing, I also just feel like the second launch that I went through was just like, it finally felt like my voice, it was authentic, and I was all out just me. There wasn't any more hiding into what I think people need me to be. And I feel more free going into this launch of Permission to Prosper. I feel a lot more free. So it was all worth it.
Well, I want to dig into that right there with you, because I know that initially when we started working together, that was one of the sticking points about finding clarity on who you're here to serve. And you had a general idea of who they were, but actually getting specific. And sometimes there can be a lot of resistance for people around what, in the industry we refer to as niching down, which I don't like that term, because I do think our minds tend to compartmentalize, and like we put that in a little bitty box, and we're like, okay, these are the only things I can do. And now I have to like act within this frame that I've given myself. And there's natural resistance that comes up to that. What I like to think of it, though, as making yourself hyper relevant to the people that you're here to serve. And that's where that specificity comes in and can serve us really well. So can you walk us through maybe some of the mindset challenges that came up for you in clarifying who your show is here to serve, and also some of the ways that you worked through that?
Yeah, you had said this with me. You were like, I know I can hear a lot of what you don't want to do, but what do you want to do? And I was like, oh, that's a different question. Because I'm like, I don't want to be like that podcast. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to talk about those things. And you'd be like, I'm hearing a lot of I don'ts. What do you want to share? So that was interesting to explore that more. Not only what do I want to share, but then, it feels like you're in a box when everybody's like, you got to niche down and you can only speak to this one very specific audience. But I remember your podcast changing, and it started resonating like really hard with me. And I was like, what in your messaging changed? And it was like, you got really clear on how to be relevant in what you're saying in your podcast for your ideal listener, but you still have a pretty big niche, right? And I was thinking like this niche was so small, but it's not. One, there's like a huge population of Christians. Two, women. Three, entrepreneurs, women with businesses. Like, that's a huge audience. And I was just thinking like, I don't want to go too narrow. Also trying to justify, like, should I close myself off if they're not a believer? Well, like, that was definitely a struggle. Is like, well, I have a message that can actually help a lot of people, not just these people. But it's like, that's where you have to get specific about what you want to share, what's authentically your voice, and let all that other stuff go. Once you understand her, and we did your psychographic and really getting down, not just like the demographic, like the really, what is she struggling with? And we went back and forward on your worksheets, like really in depth, some of these problems. And one thing that you really challenged me on that really helped me get that clarity was not using generic fluff words, which in the Christian space is actually pretty easy to do. Like, I just want to help women make more impact and income. What does that mean? You would be like, what is impact for you might be different for impact for someone else. And I was like, oh, so what is it really that she's trying to get at? That was the big thing for me, is really getting into her real problems, her real challenges so that I could be more relevant. And that also helps me stand out in the sea of podcasts around this topic. Like I knew there were things I didn't want to talk about because how do you talk about money without talking about faith or God in my demographic? For my listener is going to be very different than offering 3 budget tips, and it helped me from everything from outlining podcasts, topics, banking ideas, titles. It helps me to know who she is. If I'm just trying to be too generic, she's not going to relate to it. She's not going to click on it. She's not going to listen. So that was definitely challenging, and it took the time. And I think people aren't willing to put the time into that work. I was willing to put in months into that work, which maybe it didn't take that much time. I have a very busy schedule, but I wanted to get it right. I wanted to really understand her, and I didn't want to be as generic as I thought, it didn't really matter. I could just kind of hit record and go.
Yeah, no, I think you're accurate in saying months. And I think this is a great thing to note and to set people's expectations around. And if you're listening right now and you haven't launched a podcast yet, it will do you so much benefit to take 90 days to research your competition. Look at what's already being offered to your niche. What topics are these shows covering? What's the format of these shows? What's the core message of these shows? What are the types of guests that they're bringing on? And where can you find a content gap to fill? And looking at the messaging of your podcast and the positioning of your podcast. Because Janine, you touched on this a moment ago, and it's so true now, especially in the content creation landscape as a whole, yes, but specifically in podcasting as things continue to evolve really rapidly in the space. Differentiation is ultimately what you're going to need if you want a podcast that can grow on its own and be recommendable. To get people listening and saying, oh my gosh, this is a show you need to listen to. I had someone message me on LinkedIn literally this week, and she was like, I love your podcast. I listen every week. It's amazing. And I love hearing those messages. And I'm always like, thank you so much. It's always so great to connect with listeners, blah, blah, blah. We're chatting in the comments. And she goes, a friend of mine recommended your podcast to me. And that is one way that I know that my content's resonating. And I think for you listening, if you podcast, then when you hear that, that's how you know that what you're bringing to the world is of value. It's one of those things that can be really tough to track, granularly, to say like, oh, this person clicked this link and now they're listening because their friend shared that link. We can't get that granular with it, but in these everyday conversations, it can be one way for you to know, yes, I'm moving in the right direction. Something else I wanted to ask you, Janine, is thinking back in that gap between the podcast that you launched and that bad review that came in and the podcast that you have now. If nothing had ever changed and things had stayed the same, how do you think that would have impacted your business? And how do you think that would have impacted you personally?
I wouldn't be the same. What's interesting about a podcast or writing a book or really publishing anything, it's almost less, this is a little counterintuitive to what we just talked about, but it's almost a little less about who it's for and more about who you become when you're doing it. And yes, it is for other people. It's not just for you. But what I mean by that is there's a personal growth and a development that happens every time you publish an episode. You're getting the clarity. The thing is, most people, I don't even know how many people have a podcast idea in their head right now who will never act on it because they're trying to justify all these things. They're afraid. They don't know how. The tech is holding them up. There's all these things that are holding them up. And also at the same time, they're trying to find their voice in their head. You won't find your voice in your head. You will find it every time you hit publish, every time you hit record, because the message fleshes out. Like you practice, you understand yourself more. Your voice gets clearer. Your message gets clearer every time you hit record and publish. When you say what would be different, I would be different. I've been able to explore even more who I want to serve by hitting publish. Or even I do a series on my podcast, Adventures with Millionaires, that I film for YouTube, but I also put the full audio experience on the podcast. And it's very challenging, but I get to play with that too. I'm no longer having these ideas in my head that I'm like, it would be cool if I could do this. I'm trying them. I'm testing them. What does this look like? Okay, I need to get better mics if I'm going to do this. Or I realize I can't be on we did a Razor, a four-wheel vehicle, and it was so loud. And there has to be some breaks in that experience or people's ears can't handle it. But I'm getting to play and have fun by testing and actually doing the thing. Most people won't do the thing. I've changed because I'm doing the thing. And I feel like finally I'm getting in the systems of consistency, which was definitely one of the hardest things to do, is the consistency is like, originally with you, I'm like, I'm going to publish one a month. And you're like, you're going to probably need more than that. And I was like, fine, 2 a month. And now I'm like, okay, weekly. And because people kept asking me for more. And then I was like, dang it, I'm failing my audience when they're literally like, when's your next podcast coming out? They should know that. They should know it hits every day on this day and they should look forward to it. And I need to do my job in treating this like a real platform to give them consistent episodes. And like I said, that is only going to make my progression and my growth faster, because now instead of 1 a month, it's 4 a month. And that's a lot more to clarify your message and get better. So I think that I've changed a lot because I've hit publish and because I'm sharing my voice and fleshing out my message. It helped me with my book too. What kind of topics do I want to add to my book? There are literal chapters of my book that came from an outline of a podcast episode.
I just want to drop the mic right there because I feel like in witnessing your journey over this last year that we've worked together and knowing you previously prior to that and just witnessing your business journey through the years, it's been incredible, the ownership and the level of responsibility that you have taken in these last 12 months. And you are someone, Janine, who is out there doing huge things, big things. You have these amazing, incredible, creative ideas that I don't think in a million years would ever come out of my brain. And you're executing on them. And you've been doing that. But yet this year, I'm seeing the acceleration. Maybe you feel it, maybe you don't, but I'm seeing that from the outside looking in, just in following your podcasting journey and looking at the ways, building on what you just said there about how you are taking ownership to show up and serve your audience. And this is so important. And it's easy to forget as a podcast host because we can get so in the weeds of, okay, I need a topic. I need to create an episode. I need to record and then I'm going to have to edit the thing and then I got to get it out there and then, okay, and I got to do it all over again next week. And then we just lose sight sometimes of why we're doing this to begin with and who we're doing it for and how important it is that we commit to our audience and our community in that way. And I just want to applaud you because you're doing a fabulous job of it. And I'm curious for someone listening right now who maybe has a podcast, or maybe someone listening who wants to start a podcast, but they've been afraid. They've been afraid of putting themselves out there in that bigger way. What would you say was one thing that helped you the most to get to the point of doing the thing and taking the action as you described and how important that is?
Well, I mean, you didn't bring me on here to promote you, but I'm going to because I feel like you make things really tangible, clear, simple, precise, understandable in your programs, in your coaching, in your community. You make it really easy to succeed. I fought myself through most of the year working with you. Like, I'm the bottleneck. Like, I kept saying that. It's me. I'm the problem. It's me. And so you gave a lot of resources that if I could just implement and get consistent in that, it would set me up for the success. And you gave here's what you need to do for your trailer. Here's what you need to do for your launch. Here's what each episode breakdown should be like. We've talked about frameworks, how sometimes frameworks can make you feel confined, but also frameworks do give you a flow so you don't have to think, what am I going to podcast today and how am I going to talk about it? Like, no, you have your teaser, like I've got your system down, you've got your outline, you've got your call to engage, your call to action, and then you've got your teaser for your next trailer. Like that's your framework. So like it does help to have that flow. And it helps to have someone like you and your coaches and your community to be able to ask some ideas, bounce some things off. Hey, can you listen to my episode? Hey, like, what am I doing wrong here? This was too, loud. This was too long. This wasn't specific enough. This trailer's too, 5 minutes. It needs to be shorter. Or the intro, you give all those tools and resources. And I think that's the thing is most people are stuck because they don't know how. How do I do this? Well, then how do I do that? Everything down to a mic, which, there's so many things. There's so much equipment that you could just hit record. A lot of the times on my Adventures with Millionaires, it's a little mic on my phone. That's it. So don't get hung up on those. The real thing is actually the implementation, which I think you do a great job of. You're not paying me to say this. And I know that's not why you brought me on. I couldn't wait to sing your praises, Courtney, because I really feel like what you have created is really meaningful. And I can tell that you care. And I can tell that you want more people to have a voice. You want more people to hit record and launch that podcast. And you always made me feel like there's opportunity, because it's like, oh, there's so many podcasts and blah, blah. You're like, there's opportunity for you. Like, it's not too late in this space. And also, like you said, your point earlier is creating good content that you love, content that your audience resonates with. We don't need other duplicates of what else is already out there. So that's why you have to find your voice, use the structure that Courtney provides to help you find that, and get the structure to make it to where you actually show up for yourself and your audience. You've made it really, really simple. You've helped me through a lot of hurdles, a lot of personal hurdles that are, even listening to your podcast, even not even your coaching and having my calls with you and stuff, like just listening to your podcast. Every time I'm like, oh, she's talking to me. I need to have this like story bank on my phones, because I always have ideas in the middle of the night, so I have a whole podcast note section because of one of your podcasts. So you're constantly giving the solutions to the problems that podcasters face. Just listen to Courtney. I don't know. Can I just end on that? Mic drop that. Just listen to Courtney. What she tells you to do.
There. That's fine. I'm good with that. All right, guys. And we'll see you. No, I'm kidding. But no, Janine, it just, when you are a creator and when you are an expert in a given field and you pour your heart into the work that you do, it's so easy to lose sight of why you do it. And we talked about this a little bit from a podcasting angle, but even from a broader business angle, I get in the weeds of the day to day and what's on my list today and what did I get to and what didn't I get to and what do I have to do tomorrow and what does the team need from me today and how can I support here and where am I like slacking and and it's all the things that coexist in my brain as the founder of a company, as the CEO of running a company, day in and day out. And so to hear that is so affirming for me. So thank you for sharing that. And it also reminds me, this is why I do what I do. This is why I'm here. And this is why I love the vehicle of podcasting, because it allows me to provide those solutions in a very easy to digest format for podcasters everywhere, all around the world. And it's incredible. So I want the same for you. If you're listening right now, you have a podcast that's not growing like you expected it to, or you want to launch a podcast. And like Janine, you want to do it right because you value your time and you don't want to waste your time creating something that nobody's going to listen to. Then take to heart everything that Janine shared with you here today, because everything she touched on is so true. There's going to be the mindset issues that come up. There's going to be the self-doubt that comes up. And at the end of the day, when we can be clear on who we're here to serve, remind ourselves that's really what matters here, and just commit to showing up and serving them and actually doing the thing and doing the work. Like you mentioned, Janine, you didn't use these words, but the rest really will fall into place. So Janine, thank you for being here today, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
Something else that I just loved about this conversation was the part where Janine mentioned how easy it can be to make excuses for why you shouldn't do something. For example, podcasting. Oh, the tech, it's complicated, it's intimidating. And what's crazy is sometimes your brain can look at something and go, yeah, that's an excuse, but it still feels very real. And that's why in the next episode, I am bringing in a tech expert who's going to teach you how to design a home studio that ultimately builds your authority using the equipment you have. Whether it's an $80 starter mic that you bought secondhand on eBay, like I did when I bought my first podcast microphone, or whether you've got high quality equipment that you've spent thousands of dollars on. And you're going to find out why having a top podcast that listeners can't wait to binge isn't actually about your equipment at all. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.